What makes one an auteur? An auteur is typically defined by their distinct, consistent vision and style across all of their work. They have a unique approach to storytelling, themes, and visuals, often controlling multiple aspects of the production. Early 20th century cinema. The auteur theory was popularized by critics like Francois Truffaut and Andre Bazin. They argued that the director, as the author of the film, was the primary creative force behind a movie. Before this, the studio system in Hollywood dominated, where producers and screenwriters and studios controlled much of the artistic direction. Directors were seen as more as technicians than artists. Post-World War II, France and the US were undergoing significant cultural changes. The rise of the youth culture, rebellion against traditional structures, influenced the way cinema was perceived. Truffaut's 400 Blows is a good example of how a director's personal vision can shape a film. It reflects Truffaut's personal experience as a troubled youth. It also comments on society's theme of alienation, making the film both a personal statement and a cultural critique. His use of the camera and the focus on youth rebellion and his nonlinear narrative reflect his distinct voice as an auteur. As the studio system began to decline and the new Hollywood movement took shape, the auteur theory became more influential. Directors like Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, and Francis Ford Coppola became icons, seen as not only masters of their craft, but also as voices that embodied specific cultural and political movements. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange represents the auteur who explores cultural anxieties about free will, violence, and authority. It's a striking blend of social critique, satire, and stylistic innovation. Kubrick's obsessive control over every element of the production, use of classical music, and meticulous framing of shots demonstrates his personal vision. It critiques the ways in which society attempts to impose order on individuals, making it a deeply political work. It's a great example of an auteur using cinema to reflect personal views against a culture and questioning of authority. Social and political context of the 60s and 70s. These years were marked by the civil rights movements, feminist activism, anti-war protests, and a general questioning of authority and traditional values. Cinema, in this context, became a space for directors to challenge the status quo and engage with political and cultural issues in ways that were previously constrained by the studio system. The rise of the blockbuster and indie cinema. In this period, the Hollywood blockbuster, with films like Jaws and Star Wars, and the rise of independent cinema redefined what it meant to be as an auteur. On one hand, commercial films raised questions about the relationship between art and commerce, and on the other, independent filmmakers sought to assert a unique personal voice outside of the system. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction is a great example of an auteur-driven film from this time period. It takes risks with narrative structure, uses sharp dialogue, and references pop culture in ways that were groundbreaking at the time. Tarantino's signature style, nonlinear storytelling, ironic violence, and a blend of high and low culture became a staple of his filmmaking. The gendered and political problem of the auteur. Throughout the 20th century, the notion of the auteur often excluded women and non-Western filmmakers, leading to questions about whose voices were being heard in cinema. Female filmmakers, particularly in the mid-20th century, were either marginalized or completely excluded from the notion of authorship, a problem that has critically examined in recent decades. A great example is Agnes Varda, often referred to as the grandmother of the French New Wave cinema. She was a pioneering female auteur who explored issues of identity, gender, and women's roles in society. Her 1962 film, Cleo from 5 to 7, is a story of a woman awaiting medical results, exploring themes of morality and self-awareness. Varda uses time and space as well as her representation of female experience. It presents a different perspective from the dominant male auteur tradition, addressing the problem of gender within the industry. Throughout the 20th century, the notion of the auteur was shaped by both practical filmmaking and the larger social and political context in which these films were produced. From the early days of auteur theory in 1940s and 50s to the rise of blockbuster cinema and independent films in the 80s and 90s, the problem of the auteur has been represented in different ways, while directors like Kubrick, Truffaut, and Tarantino have been seen as definitive examples of the auteur. The evolution of gender and cultural diversity within cinema complicates and expands on the notion of authorship, suggesting that the auteur is not only about individual control, but also about the broader cultural and social forces that shape cinematic expression.